Club of Louisville. I'm Julie Schmidt, President-elect of the club and Senior Director of External Affairs for KET. To lead us in our invocation is Ginger Wallace, retired Colonel of the United States Air Force. But it's been many years, and we're so pleased to have Dr. James Bullard. He's a native of Minnesota. He received his doctorate degree in economics from IU and bachelor's of science degrees in economics and in quantitative methods and information systems from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. An almost 30-year veteran of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, he has served in various roles, moving up the ranks and has published extensively on economic policy issues. In 2008, Dr. Bullard was appointed president, overseeing the Federal Reserve's 8th District, which encompasses the St. Louis headquarters and branches in Little Rock, Arkansas, Memphis, Tennessee, and of course right here in Louisville, Kentucky. In his present role as president, he participates on the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee, otherwise known as the FOMC, the group that makes monetary policy for the Federal Reserve System. Jim has a real passion for economic research, information, and education. He's a noted economist and scholar, and his positions are formulated and founded on research-based thinking and an intellectual openness to new theories and explanations. He's widely respected and has been championing a more transparent and accessible Fed during his tenure as president. He's active in his community, and he currently serves on the board of the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce and the Concordance Academy of Leadership. My curiosity got me that, so I looked that one up, and wow, what a mission. He's really just a tremendous leader, and we're honored to invite him to the podium. Please help me welcome him, Dr. Bullard.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me out today. I'm looking forward to hearing all your comments on the economy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the world of monetary policy in the U.S. and around the world. And I titled this A Substantial Turn in Monetary Policy during 2019. And for those that don't follow this, as closely as others, there's kind of been a sea change in the way monetary policy, the outlook for monetary policy during 2019. So I just wanted to walk you through that and talk about that, and we'll get into some other questions at the end. There's a Q&A, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we have slides either up here. What's that? There we go. This is a blank slide. So if you don't want to listen to the whole talk, you can just look at this slide. The economy's been slowing down in 2019 after relatively rapid growth in 2017 and 2018. I'll talk about that a little bit. There's some downside risks for the economy, and I'll talk about those a little bit. If those risks materialize, then the slowdown could be sharper than we thought, and that would make it harder for us to hit our inflation objective, which is 2%. We haven't been able to hit that really since 2012. So what the FOMC has done is tried to insure against the downside risk in the U.S. economy, and especially with our rate cuts just in the last 3 meetings here. So this is the basics outline of the story here. So let's start with the part about the slowing U.S. economy. You might not believe it, but it really is true. According to the latest figures, the economy grew at about 2.5% for all of 2018. But even during 2018, people were projecting that 2019 would be a slower year for the U.S. economy, and that's because potential growth is thought to be only 1.7 or 1.8 or 2%, depending on who you talk to. Anyway, something less than 2.5%. So usually you would expect the economy to slow down during 2019. And the risk part is the part that, well, anytime something's slowing, you get worried that you slow faster than you hoped. And if you slow too fast, you might even go all the way So I love this picture here, so I'm going to dwell on it for a little while. This picture shows U.S. GDP growth measured from 1 year earlier. And the blue line is what actually happened. This chart goes back to 2017, March of 2017, so shortly after the election. And you can see the blue line was at 2% at that point in the left-hand part of this chart. And those dotted gold boxes there are what the FOMC thought would happen. So if nothing else, this picture establishes that we aren't very good predictors of what's going to happen in the economy. We thought that, as a group, we thought that the economy would just grow at 2% as far as the eye could see. That's what those gold dots are telling you. But that isn't what actually happened. 2017, 2018 were actually very good years for the economy, so the blue line went up, up, up to almost to 3% or over 3% on a year-over-year basis. A lot of that's the deregulatory agenda, the corporate tax reform that was passed. And then started to decline, so I labeled that the upside surprise on the left-hand side of this chart. Then the blue line started to decline and has declined all the way down back to 2%. So that was that part is the expected slowdown part on the right-hand part of this chart. And the question is whether that blue line will just continue to go down and go down to 1% or even lower than that. That would be the risk part of this in this picture. So this is the kind of the basic setting for what we've been talking about for the U.S. economy. And I like this picture because it gives you a little bit better sense of the dynamics than just looking at, say, the unemployment rate or something like that. Unemployment's very low in the U.S. economy, but it doesn't quite give you the whole story that you get out of this kind of a picture. So what are these downside risks to growth? Well, probably the largest one is the global trade uncertainty that has been kind of rocking the global economy. We lowered the policy rate in the face of this trade policy uncertainty because we're worried that this trade policy uncertainty might slow us down more than we expected. Now, on trade, I would say a couple things. It's going to be hard, I think, in the current environment to reach a stable global trade regime. That requires agreements. It's not just us, but it's all sides have to come to an agreement. It's pretty hard to reach that kind of agreement. If you know anything about trade over the post-war era, the agreements, the trade liberalization that occurred over the post-war era was hard fought, and it was a product of many, many years, decades of the U.S. insisting on lower and lower tariffs and access to foreign markets and trading that off with other people around the world. So because we have a lot of trade regime uncertainty in the current environment, what that's doing is chilling global investment. So if you're a business people, and some of you are doing this globally, and you're thinking of building a plant somewhere in the world, you're wondering, well, what are the future trade relationships going to be between that particular country and the U.S. in the future, because that's going to affect your bottom line in building that kind of investment. So that chilling effect is occurring globally, and we're a little bit worried that that global effect could come back to haunt the U.S. economy eventually. So here's a picture that I also like, which talks about trade policy uncertainty. This is an index that's used in the academic literature. It's based on mentions of trade and trade uncertainty in social media and other places. This goes back to the year 2000. You can see that a typical value for this index would have been 100 from 2000 to 2016, but since then it's much higher, 300 or 400, just eyeballing the averages there. So what you have in the current environment is a lot of uncertainty about what the future trade regime is going to be, and you have, and this is just ongoing uncertainty. So I'm just, as a policymaker, I just want to think about the uncertainty being high and therefore chilling global investment. So as monetary policymakers, we can't really react to day-to-day tit-for-tat trade negotiations. The nature of trade negotiations is that one side threatens something, the other side threatens something else, one side gives a concession, the other side concedes something else. Looks like a deal is going to be made, then no deal is going to be made, then a deal is going to be made. You can't react to this kind of thing day to day because then you'd be moving interest rates around like crazy and you'd get a lot more volatility. So I think the best way to think of this is just that you're in a negotiating phase and it's probably going to go on for quite a while. The uncertainty is going to be high for quite a while. What can you do with monetary policy to help cushion the impact of that? As I said, trade policy uncertainty creates a disincentive for global investment. So what has happened is that the global growth environment has deteriorated, not so much in the U.S., but more elsewhere. And the worry is that that might feed back into slower growth in the U.S. So this is a table that uses projections by the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. On the left side there, you've got the U.S., Euro area, UK, Japan, China. By the time you get all the way over to the right column, you see that all these growth rates have been marked down, except for Japan. And Japan's growth rate came out relatively weak this morning for third quarter growth. So the main one here is Europe, the minus 0.8% on the right-hand part of this chart. So Europe's not growing as fast. The European economy is sort of a similar size as the U.S. economy, but a lot of red numbers on the right-hand side there. So there's been a global growth slowdown in the last 18 months or so. Here's global manufacturing, picture of that. This is a purchasing managers index. Anything above 50 means expansion, below 50 means contraction. So everything was going great in 2018, but this has been declining and now shows contraction on the right-hand part of this chart. Here's U.S. manufacturing. This is the same story, same kind of story. Industrial production is the blue line on the left axis there. So 0 is the relevant benchmark there. And then on the right-hand side of this chart is the ISM manufacturing index. So anything below 50 on that scale is contraction. So both the industrial production figures and the index are showing manufacturing contracting. So it's the manufacturers that are doing things globally. They're producing things all over the world. It's those guys that have to make investment decisions, major investment decisions about where to build plants. So it makes a lot of sense that it would be that sector where you see the most impact on the U.S. economy as opposed to other parts of the economy. So this is where the risk is. I don't have pictures here about the U.S. labor market. The U.S. labor market's doing very well. I don't have pictures here about U.S. consumption growth. Households are spending a lot because they all have jobs. They're doing very well. They're spending a lot. Businesses that are U.S. facing or domestic facing, they tend to do very well. Probably a lot of your companies, if you're strictly domestically facing, you might do pretty well. But this is showing you where the risk is, the downside risk to the U.S. economy. Here's U.S. business investment. So this was growing at a 4 or 5% rate, let's say in 2018. Now it's tailed off down to about 1% growth rate. So it hasn't quite gone into contraction, but it's slowed quite a bit. In the meantime, inflation has been very low and under control in the U.S. for a long time. So let me just talk about that in a couple of slides here. We have a stated inflation objective of 2%. This is something that was set up in 2012. But right now, both inflation and inflation expectations are below target. One thing about inflation being low in the current environment is, gosh, you have this booming labor market. You have unemployment with a 3 handle and a 50-year low with unemployment. The previous conventional wisdom was, oh, if you can't find workers, then wages are going to get bid up and inflation is going to be spreading through the economy. That doesn't seem to be happening, even though we've we've had 2 years or more, 2.5 years of upside surprise on the U.S. economy. So one thing that our rate cuts might help do is help center inflation and inflation expectations back toward the 2% that we're trying to hit, and instead of getting numbers that are below the 2% range. So here's the picture. This is core PCE inflation. That's one of our favorite measures of inflation. That's the blue line. This goes back to 2014. You know, pretty much consistently running below our target. Not way below our target, but below our target, definitely. And expected inflation as well. So the market doesn't seem to think we're going to hit the inflation target either. And so that's a concern for the Fed. So we'd like to get those. This line should be bouncing around 2%. It shouldn't be consistently below 2%. Both of these lines should be bouncing around 2%. So we'd like to get that right. Now during 2019, we did make a big change in policy. So the committee doesn't have blindfolds on. We did understand that these risks were out there, and we did understand that 2019 would be a slowdown year. So what the FOMC started to do in the beginning of the year was to project less increases in the policy rate. And as we got toward the June, July, August, September timeframe, we actually started cutting the policy rate, and we've actually made 3 rate cuts in the last 3 meetings. So you could ask, well, what was the effect of this turnaround in U.S. monetary policy? Some people say, well, you know, if you lower the policy rate by 25 basis points, 1/4, 1%, how much of a difference can that really make? But I'm going to make an argument that we did much more than that, because at this time last year, if I've been talking to you, the committee's projection would have been not only that we weren't going to cut rates, but they were actually going to raise rates. So the projection going into 2019 was that we were going to raise rates. We didn't do that. Instead, we turned around and lowered rates. So if you take a look at this chart, which is another favorite of mine, I have a lot of favorite charts. I don't know really how to rate them, which one's really my true favorite, but this is one of my favorites. So this shows, bankers in the room will know this chart well. This shows the 10-year yield on a 10-year U.S. Treasury. That's the blue line in this picture. This goes back to August of last year, so a little more than a year ago. And you can see on the left-hand part of this chart, that blue line was running around 3%, over 3%, kind of high for recent years. And then that gold line is the 2-year Treasury yield. What I like about the 2-year Treasury yield is that that's what the market thinks the Fed is doing today, and also what the Fed is going to do over the next 2 years. So the whole idea of monetary policy is kind of embodied in the 2-year. And you can see as the committee started to change attitude in late 2018, both of these rates started to fall, and then the committee actually went ahead and made the rate cuts in July, September, and October meetings. Those are the vertical lines on the right-hand side of this chart. And by the time you get all done here, the 2-year yield has fallen about 130 basis points, or 1.3 percentage points. So that's, in this world, in the bond trading world, in the banking world, this is a huge move, a sea change in policy. So it's not just that we made a little tiny move on the margin. This is actually quite a large move. Now, because all of you know Milton Friedman by heart, and you just got done reading price theory last night, you know that he said there's log and variable lags between monetary policy actions and the effects on the economy. So these lower rates would be having some effect now during the second half of 2019, but then would also be expected to influence the economy during 2020 and even out to 2021. So I think now is probably, we've made a big move here. It's probably time to wait and see what the effects of this policy move will be during coming quarters. So I already said this, dropped by 130 some basis points, big change. This is fed through the longer term U.S. yields, so you know other things like mortgage rates and borrowing rates for companies have come down as well. So we've got a lot more accommodative policy than we did as of this time late last year. Some of you know about yield curve issues. So the yield curve is different maturities along the treasury. So you can have a treasury that's a short maturity, like a 2-year I was just talking about, or a 10-year that's considered longer maturity. Usually you would think that the 10-year yield would be higher than the 2-year yield. You have to give up your money for 10 years as opposed to 2 years. You should get rewarded for that as an investor. Unfortunately, the yield curve has been inverted during much of 2019. And worse than that, an inverted yield curve has tended to predict recession in the U.S. economy during the post-war era. It actually has a very good track record of predicting downturns in the U.S. economy. So this is something I've been concerned about. I felt that policymakers should not make excuses about this, but should take a market signal about where rates should be. I think we did take some of that signal. And now we've got a curve that used to be inverted, but now, just in recent weeks, with our latest move, has turned somewhat positive. So I think this is a bullish factor for the economy going forward. So here's the picture. You can subtract. What people do is just subtract one yield from the other, the 10-year minus the 2-year, let's say on this, that's the gold line in this chart. Some of these various measures were negative on the right-hand side of this chart. Those are temporary inversion over parts of this year. But now all of these have turned positive right over on the right-hand side of this picture. So hopefully we've skirted the bearish signal that would have come from more severe yield curve inversion than already occurred during 2019. All right, so let's finish up and open it up for questions. We faced a slowing economy during 2019. We knew that was going to happen, but we also got more headwinds and downside risk than we might have anticipated coming into 2019, in part due to global trade regime uncertainty. In the meantime, we've been low on the inflation side and the inflation expectation side, so it'd be nice to recenter that at 2%. We've taken major action during 2019 to realign U.S. monetary policy. We're providing more accommodation to the U.S. economy than we would have otherwise. And now we've got a positively sloped yield curve, which hopefully will be a bullish factor for 2020. So I'll finish there, and I'd be happy to talk about any of this. If you want to rank those favorite charts, I'd like, you're welcome to do that. But if you want to talk about anything else, we'll certainly do that as well. So thanks very much, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Bullard. Amazingly clear. The administration has pulled no punches about criticizing the Fed and Chairman Powell specifically for not being aggressive enough. And would you comment briefly on what the risks would be of being too aggressive?
I think you have to have some smoothness in monetary policy making, otherwise you'll get a lot of volatility in financial markets. Even the moves that we made this year caused a lot of consternation, not just in the U.S. but around the world. So I do think there has to be some measured approach to monetary policy making so that you get relatively smooth outcomes. I think we have achieved that this year. Like I said, this is a pretty big move in the world of monetary policy, and it's like driving a super tanker. It takes a long time to make your turn, and I think we've done that this year.
Jim, is it possible to quantify the deleterious effect to the economy of the tariffs, i.e. trade uncertainty that you indicated there in the charts?
Yeah, I kind of glossed over it. I did have a line in there that says, if you just take the tariffs by themselves and you just put those numbers into a model, you will actually get pretty small effects. And the reason for that is only certain goods are affected, and even those goods, there are substitutes for those goods, and people can buy other products instead of the ones that have the tariffs on them. So you'll get pretty small effects. Where you get bigger effects is in the global trading regime, which kind of messes up the supply chains of companies around the world, and they aren't sure where to invest around the world. That's where you see the slowdown occurring, but that's coming through global growth slowing down. That means that the markets that our companies can sell to are then smaller. So you have to have those kinds of effects in your model in order to see what can happen through trade, and you don't always see that through the direct effects that are in macroeconomic models. So I think there's a fair amount of judgment here about what the ultimate effects of a major trade war would be on the U.S.
Dr. Bullard, thank you for your comments. My name is Tony Coffey, and my question regards the labor force participation rate. It was 67% around the turn of the century, 66% in the 08-09 recession, and now it's sticky around 63%. So what does this mean for economic growth potential, and is it a factor of what we're seeing with lack of wage inflation?
Well, not to be too flippant, but it means we're getting older. So one important factor is, in fact, the aging of the U.S. workforce, and because of that, the headline numbers on participation are lower. And it's something we really have to think about and work with, because we've got a lot of people with a lot of human capital that have been in their positions for a long time, and all these baby boomers are retiring every day, and they're being replaced by much younger workers. So this imbalance between young and old is something that's affecting the labor force participation rate. It has increased more now with the hotter labor market, so I would say after the last 2 years, the downward decline in labor force participation has leveled out, flattened out, or even increased for some groups. So I think that's a sign that we have a very strong labor market. I think it's a very good thing. You're also drawing a lot of people into the labor force that previously wouldn't have been participating in nearly as high numbers. So you've got African American unemployment declining, Hispanic American unemployment declining. So that's a great thing. You're drawing people into the workforce. They'll get skills and be able to weather the next downturn better than they otherwise would have been able to. So I think some good things are happening from the hot labor market, and we'll benefit from that.
Thank you very much for being here. My name is Larry Sloan, and my question has to do with negative interest rates. What would be the consequence of negative interest rates? It's hard for me to understand why I would want to buy a bond that I would actually get less principal back on at the end of the bond's term. So just some comments on negative interest rates, please.
Yeah, in Japan and also in Europe, we have a lot of sovereign debt. We see a lot of sovereign debt that's carrying negative yields, not just at short interest rates, but also out the yield curve quite a ways. This has not occurred in the U.S. I think that's because the U.S. economy is a stronger economy than either Japan or Europe. We have more projected growth rates. We have a more dynamic economy with more innovation. A lot of the leading companies are out in the U.S., so I think part of that is keeping interest rates somewhat higher in the U.S. Also, you've got inflation as a factor, so real rates are probably about equalized across the three economies, Japan, U.S., and Europe, depending on how you want to do that calculation. So a real rate would be you take the nominal interest rate and subtract off the expected inflation that would occur during the holding period. So in the U.S., the 10 years trading, under 2%. Expected inflation also somewhat under 2%. So if you subtract one from the other, you're going to get 0. In Japan, the 10-year JGB is trading at about 0. But on the other hand, expected inflation is is also about zero, so you subtract 0 from 0, you get 0. So that's a more complicated pieces of math today, but the point is, in either Japan or the U.S., just based on that simple calculation, we'd have equalized real rates of return. But that's because the monetary policymakers in Japan are not going to, are not expected to be able to generate the 2% inflation that they're targeting over that time frame. So if you want to do Europe as well, that would be a little bit more complicated calculation. But I think real returns do get equated across the world, and if you really think they're not equated, then there would be an arbitrage opportunity, and you could go out and make $1 billion.
Thank you again for being here. I wanted to ask about on manufacturing. You spoke of there's some uncertainty in terms of future investment and so forth with the policies that are in place. And I'm just curious, since our region is so focused on manufacturing, how it may impact the Kentuckiana region.
Yeah, I think the success of U.S. manufacturing has been to specialize and have higher value-added products, and probably the lower value-added or the more labor-intensive type of products, those have gone elsewhere. But there is some reshoring going on in the current environment. That's something I'd like to hear about while I'm here in Louisville. But the issue about how to set up a global supply chain in a world where you're not sure what the tariff arrangements are going to be between countries, I think that's a very difficult problem. So, the way it was before the current uncertainty about trade policy was that you could just commit to whatever country you thought was your cheapest, your best bet, and maybe it was China, and you'd say, okay, I'll go all in with China and produce there. Now I think what corporate boardrooms are doing, and there's probably people in the room that are much better at this than I am, but I think what's happening is that you have to develop a corporate strategy that takes into account that the trade regime is going to be uncertain. So this means diversifying suppliers across a variety of countries, maybe picking countries that you think are less likely to be targets in the trade war. It might mean some reshoring. There could be various strategies that you would take to be able to cope for a 5 or 10 year period going forward where you're not sure what the rules are going to be. And to me, that would be business 101. That's exactly what you should do in this to react to an uncertain situation. And once you have that kind of supply chain set up, then everything would settle down, because that kind of supply chain would be able to handle the fact that changes are occurring in the policy, the tariff policy as time goes forward. So I think that's happening, but I'd like to hear more from you all about whether that's okay.
Mr. Bullard, focusing on the long term for a moment in terms of our economic growth as a country, I read an article a couple of years ago talking about the increase in labor growth, the expected increase in the number of available workers, and the increase in productivity, or the type of productivity. The article is basically arguing that there are limits, because in order to have real increase in the economy, you've got to have both increase in productivity and an increase in the number of workers. So I'm just wondering, and the argument then was, it's unlikely that we're going to have a long-term growth of greater than 2%, although at that time there were politicians and others arguing we could have 3.5 or 4% growth, which I guess we had for a short period of time. Now it's gone back down. So I'm wondering if you comment on this interrelationship and what we might do as a nation in particular to affect productivity growth and labor growth, and in particular, if you might comment on immigration policy.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it very much does tie to the long-run prospects for the U.S. economy. It does depend on, what is the productivity growth going to be? We're in an era of low productivity growth since about 2005. So this is quite a while. We did have an era of high productivity growth from about 1995 to 2005. The low number is about 1.25%. The high number is about 3%. So it really makes a big difference if you jump up to that high productivity growth regime. A lot will happen, and U.S. growth rate would pick up a lot if we could do that. Now, I get asked this all the time: why is this not happening, Jim? Why is this not happening? And I have to say, ultimately, I'm pretty optimistic. I think we have a lot of very interesting technology, many ideas. There are many things that could be done and could be done better. So there are ways to improve productivity, to actually get that to flow through the business processes and actually manifest itself into better production methods and high quality, lower cost products. That's been very hard to do. One idea about why this hasn't been happening is that a lot of the newest technology has been leisure focused or consumer focused. So our lives actually are better, but they're better because we can tweet cat videos back and forth to each other. Not because you're actually producing, the building faster rate or producing widgets better than you were. So the leisure focus, I think, has been a factor, but all of that technology is still there, and it will get absorbed into business processes and improve the productivity growth rate in the U.S. U.S. is still a leader on these kinds of things, so I think we have a lot of good prospects for the future. On the labor side, number of workers matters, and we are aging. I'm very much for a legal immigration program that would look like Canada or Australia, who I think have been the best at this. They get points for various types of skills. They look at what they need inside the country and they give a little bit higher weight to those that have those kind of skills that they need coming into the country. Australia in particular felt like they didn't have a big enough population. They were going to need more people if they were going to be successful. And they've been very successful in recruiting from elsewhere in Asia especially. So I think a lot could be done on this. And the other thing, and I think is very important, we have an age skew in the U.S., too many old people, not enough young people, but if you could bring in immigrants to balance that out, then you wouldn't have to reform your old age pension programs and stuff. You could get that all fixed through the immigration program if you do that in a smart way. I think there's a lot of good things that could be done. It's obviously a very hot political issue now, but sometimes when it's a hot political issue, it's the time when people actually focus on it, and now you can get a good program in place that makes sense for the future of the U.S. economy. You guys have been very patient. Thanks very much for coming out today.
Thank you again, Dr. Bullard, and thank you to the board for being here today and also for your service. And my good friend Randy, so good to see you, and Maria, our former Rotarian, good to have you back with us today. So would you all please join me again in thanking him for the presentation. As you leave, don't forget the What is Rotary table. Pick up your member directory if you've not already done so, and register for the party. It's coming soon. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.